And on that note, we go to the next one, which I know we are watching pretty closely, which for Brent, unfortunately, I think will be
More
hard.
litigation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Brent's going to be a very busy man. This is the 20% circuit breaker. I call it a cap. They're not calling it a cap, but it's a cap on commercial property.
Yeah, bad word, legislature says you can't call it a cap.
Yeah.
It's really a value limitation.
Value
Well,
limitation.
The lieutenant governor said he's not going to pass caps, so.
Right.
So they had to call it
Had to
something
call
Value
else.
limitation.
Right, yeah, yeah.
So Brent, how are you going to handle this one?
Well, so, and this is somewhat similar to the current 10% cap that we have on the residential homestead properties.
But that one's called a cap.
But that one is
Yeah.
a cap. They call that a cap. It only applies to real property that's not a homestead, because the homestead gets their 10%. Real property, non-homestead, with a value of less than $5 million. It's a 3-year pilot program. We understand it that the base year is the 2023 value. So any value that goes up in 2024, more than 20% on those properties will be capped.
What's a property?
Well, that's the other.
Oh, that's mean.
That's a great question. That's a great question. We're interpreting it to mean by our parcel ID numbers. So if you have,
Each individual account number.
each individual account number in our records is a property. So what we anticipate is that some property owners who have condominiums or strip commercial centers
Mineral
that-
interests.
that are over
Yeah.
that are over $5 million, they may go and replat those and parcel those out so that they can have individual account numbers below that $5 million threshold. Yes, and John brings up a good point. Mineral interest, oil and gas, in the tax code is considered real property. And I got some information from the comptroller's office that there are 6,935,000 oil and gas accounts in the state of Texas. 6,926,000 of those have a value of less than $5 million. So 99.88% of all oil and gas accounts are subject to this 20% cap. And I don't know if y'all have watched the oil and gas market in the last 40 years, but it goes up and down considerably. We actually had a point where I believe the price of oil was negative at one point. So when something goes down to zero one year and it goes up next year, 20% of zero is
Yeah.
zero. So what do we do in those situations? So there's just a lot of concerns on how this is going to play out. And then you've got concerns on those properties that they were below the $5 million threshold this year on the market value. They get a cap. Then the next year it gets reappraised, the market value goes up to $6 million. Do they still qualify for the cap? Is it based off the market value? Is it based off of the assessed value? Just a lot of unknowns. This was part of that last minute property tax relief package. The House and Senate argued with each other during the full regular session, throughout the full first special session, and throughout all of the second special session until the last hour. And they dropped this. Everybody was shocked by this and other parts of it that we'll talk about if we have time. And they didn't ask any questions. They didn't come to anyone. They just knew, hey, we finally got a deal. We can get property tax relief. Don't ask questions because we don't want to screw it up. And here we are.
Now, to be fair, the normal process, this would have been talked about in committees and debated in both houses, but they had already, as Brent talked about, gone through 3 sessions in essence to go with this. And then this shows up and it passes and nobody knows, what does it mean? Now, so just to be clear, is everybody in the state on your end of the business, as far as you know, going to go with the parcel thing? I think that's the correct thing, but.
As far as I've heard, I haven't
Okay.
heard anyone.
Because the other way to look at it is, because the wording of this is vague. Yeah, they use 3 different terms when they talk about this. They say real property, they say property, they say parcel of real property, all of which mean different things. And so it's like, that's part of the thing we see why it was so poorly done. Now, before y'all go racing out there thinking, oh boy, happy, happy, joy, joy, uh, there's a limit. They can still raise your property. And they can raise it up to 20% and they're still fine. So it's only increases above 20%. So to go to Brent's example, if you had literally, you were right at the threshold, 5 million, that means they could take you to $6 million and they're still fine. Now, if they go to 6 million and one, that $1 they can't tax you on.
Right.
So 20% is a huge movement. Do we see those in our litigation practice? Yeah, that's why they come to us. Because that was like, wow, insane, crazy. But that doesn't happen a lot. The real issue on this thing, because it's a pilot program, including a pilot constitutional amendment, which I don't think I've ever seen.
Right.
But it expires in 3 years. It's good for 24, 25, and 26. And then the legislature is going to have to re-up it if they want to continue it. And the real concern, I think, on Kevin's part is, okay, I can live with the 20%, but what if they take it down to where the homes are at 10%? What if, and they're all talking about taking homes down to 5. That's an annual 5, 3, 1, 0. What if they do that? What does that do to Kevin's budget? Kevin, where are you on that?
Well, so always a concern, but as you mentioned, the other issue, like I mentioned on daycare and biomeds, is that it's hard for us to even know what the impact is going to be. And so we're guessing on so many of these things, but that's always our concern, is that when you kind of start with something and then everybody in the legislature wants to, make it better, which means bringing those caps even farther down. Again, when you do those caps, it is just shifting burden again. The problem is at some point you put enough caps on there, there's nowhere to shift it anymore. And so it's, I say that there's still most of us in local government feel like there's largely an anti-local control feeling in Austin. And I always encourage people to remember that we, as local government officials, are elected by our constituents. And generally speaking, we believe the closer you are to your constituents, the more you understand them, and the better you're able to govern them. It doesn't work that way in Austin all the time. But and sometimes I think that is because there's a variety of what's going on in the state, and they call it patchwork, which I hear that, but you oftentimes end up punishing a large percentage of the local governments for a very small minority of potentially not so good governments. But it's a very tough situation that we have to deal with, and Denton County is actually, we are in a good situation that we are the 4th fastest growing county in the country, not just in the state. That helps us. So we, for example, this last budget reduced our tax rate by 3 cents, which doesn't sound like a lot until our tax rate's 18.9 cents now. So that's a significant reduction. That's entirely the result of how much growth we're seeing, because we're under that, those terms we call the no new revenue rate, which means we're not going to, for the average homeowner, in fact, the average homeowner in Denton County will see a reduction in their absolute taxes from the county. They should be seeing a reduction on their school tax, so it should be some good things. But there are a lot of other counties and cities that don't have that same growth benefit, and some of these things put them in a real bind to provide the services that are oftentimes needed, because it's rare that you talk to a resident and say, well, we need to fire 10% of our police officers, and that's not something most people are very excited about, right? So these are these are tough decisions that we have to make, and it's what we do.
How many nasty calls do you get when you raise the tax rate or people things, or they're just on an average time, say when the bills come out October, even when you were mayor, how many people called you to complain about the bill?
A lot. Probably even more as mayor, only because people tend to know their mayor maybe a little. I mean, and a lot of people don't know what a county commissioner does. But I, in both cases, will get a lot when there are tax. And what we said before, if you remember from that little trivia question thing, a lot of people think that Denton County controls the Denton Central Appraisal District, which is absolutely not the case.
So what do you do? Do you pass the buck? Or
Well-
what do you do when, I mean, just in fairness, in case any of you want to call your county commissioner, what is it you tell people when they call you?
Well, so education is important, so I try to explain that thing, but I will tell you, people that are mad really don't want an education. So you first want to hear them, right, and understand what they're doing, but I usually find that if you can get with them, and oftentimes what ends up happening is that as mayors, council members, commissioners, and this happens a lot, Isabella, my chief administrator, has a lot of this, is that you get called for a lot of things that have nothing to do with you, but it's better if we can help direct that to who can help with that particular situation. So we do a lot of that. It's hard to do that because we're not trying to throw our appraisal districts under the bus. So we have to help explain, but we can help explain what we are doing. And again, we hear a lot of things that may have to do with their broader tax bill, and we have to listen. We need to listen to that and understand that, because it's still, that's what they have to deal with.
But correct me if I'm wrong, Brent and Kevin. If you call your local officials, they can't do anything about it.
No.
Because if they pick up the phone or send an email to Brent, they have committed a crime.
That's right.
They cannot legally talk to the appraisal district about any value.
That's right.
And so now, okay, nobody prosecutes chief appraisers for or local government officials for a misdemeanor for doing this. But on the other hand, that's what you're asking them to do. So, you know, and in the past, I've had clients do that, and somebody writes a really polite letter saying, hey, would you know, this guy contacted me, would you kind of make sure everything's okay? I mean, totally vanilla, innocuous, and boy, that sends chief appraisers through the roof.
Yep.
So don't do it if you do it. So.
So to
You'll have your local property tax consultant.
Yes. So
Yeah,
kind
there
of
you
coming
go.
back to this cap, and Rhonda, how are y'all preparing for this? I mean, everyone sees a cap. My guess is it's going to pass. Are y'all ready for this?
Yeah, it's a value limitation. It's similar to other ones that we work with, but I
Right.
mean, we're gonna start with the same basis they do, which is market value.
Market
I
value.
mean, that's what we're looking for.
And by each
Well,
account number.
I think the interesting point is when you get into economic units, when you value something as an economic unit. So you now may have properties within that economic unit, say, a shopping center, as an example. You may have a lot of properties that are under that $5 million threshold, but you've got one anchor tenant that's really assessed. So it's going to be interesting when it comes to those types of ECUs when we appraise them and stuff. But, you know, the basis is market value, and that's what we're looking for.
That's
so.
kind of for litigation for us as well, is if I'm trying to settle a shopping center that has multiple account numbers, I look at it as a whole and say, okay, 27 million, and I let the district allocate it. Well, I might not be doing that anymore. I might want to allocate it myself.
Remember that shopping center, they're paying the tax bill for that shopping center, and then allocating it.
That's right. So the question then becomes,
You don't have to worry about it.
but if you have some that are
Yeah, they
under the
allocate it
cap
after
and
the
some
fact.
over, how are you going to then allocate it? That becomes the problem on the owners, and you're right, I mean,
Yeah.
that is what you do.
And
Right.
typically,
but-
the owners just are gonna pass that through to the
But,
tenants.
but
or
how
the
do you
tenants that are in the
handle the
building.
cap? Because, okay,
Well,
one of your tenants
yeah.
is down, and the
Yeah.
other one is up,
No,
and
no,
so
I get
does
it.
that tenant pay the tax? You know, you prorate it equally, or what?
And most of those leases will have those CAM definitions, which are usually by pro rata square footage or something, which doesn't match up with what we just said.
Yep.
It's going to match up perfectly, because the building's $100 million is the 20%, and it's going to be allocated by the square footage of each of those individual tenants. If the individual tenant has personal property inside of their facility, then they fall under that personal property.
Yeah, I could,
The personal, you're right.
but I
about
could tell you
personal.
that's not always the real case, because the anchor tenants have a sweetheart deal. That's the reality there.
Yeah.
Yep.
So they're paying maybe, $5 a square foot, and you've got these smaller tenants paying $10 a square foot. So it doesn't always work out that way.
Well, and again, if you have the anchor tenant, that building on as a property ID in the CAD's records, and it's over $5 million, it's not going to be subject to the cap. And then you have the subsequent accounts that are under 5 million, and if they do get a cap, how are you allocating that across? I think there's just,